When you hit a brick wall, like with a massive problem, I feel like the natural human instinct is to just hyper-focus.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, you pull out the magnifying glass, you zoom in on the immediate details, and you just try to force a solution through sheer willpower.
Right. You get this intense tunnel vision. The assumption is sort of that if you just apply more pressure to this one specific friction point, the obstacle will just, eventually shatter.
Yeah, exactly. But former U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower had this completely counterintuitive approach for moments like that. He said, and this is a quote, "If a problem cannot be solved, enlarge it."
Enlarge it. Which, I mean, that sounds completely backwards when you're already feeling totally overwhelmed by a crisis, right?
Right.
The instinct is always to shrink the problem, not make it bigger.
But today, we're diving into how that exact counterintuitive philosophy is actually being proposed as a master key, like a way to unlock some of the world's most intractable, dangerous geopolitical conflicts.
Yeah, it's a fascinating framework.
So we are unpacking a massive analysis by George Beebe. For those who don't know, he's the former director for Russia analysis at the CIA, and he's currently the director of grand strategy at the Quincy Institute.
And we should probably pause here just to make something crystal clear to you, the listener. The geopolitical topics we're covering in this deep dive today, I mean, they span U.S., Russian, and Iranian relations, the war in Ukraine.
Heavy stuff.
Very heavy. These are incredibly complex, highly politically charged issues with very real human stakes.
Exactly. So our mission here is strictly to unpack Beebe's specific framework. We are definitely not here to endorse any particular nation's political viewpoint or, advocate for a specific foreign policy.
Right. We're putting on the strategist's hat, basically.
Yeah, we just want to understand the mechanics of his argument, because the way he connects these global dots, it really challenges a vast amount of the conventional wisdom you see in the headlines every day.
It really does. It forces you to look at things completely differently.
So let's start with the immediate crisis. Recently, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, he actually acknowledged to the press that the U.S. mediation effort between Russia and Ukraine has, essentially stalled out.
Yeah, it's just hit a wall.
Right. Talks like the Anchorage summit, they were failures because they just couldn't secure agreements. So the administration is openly looking for new ideas.
Which is exactly where Beebe's application of Eisenhower comes in. Because when a direct bilateral negotiation fails, when staring at that immediate friction point just isn't working, you don't just keep hammering the same nail.
You step back.
Exactly. You step back. You enlarge the frame of the problem.
But Beebe argues that a lot of Western leaders are basically fundamentally misinterpreting what Eisenhower meant. Like they're confusing the word enlarging with the word escalating.
And those are two entirely different mechanisms. I mean, totally different.
To see the difference, look at a recent meeting at the White House between Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky. The logic presented there was essentially, escalate to de-escalate.
Yeah, that was the phrase being thrown around.
The theory being that if you increase the pain level on Russia, like by authorizing long-range strikes deep into Russian territory, the cost of continuing the war becomes just too high.
Right, and that forces them to the negotiating table.
Exactly.
And you can easily see the intuitive appeal of that logic if you are viewing the war strictly through a bilateral lens.
Sure, it makes sense on paper.
Right. If you believe this is just a localized fight between Russia and Ukraine over a specific piece of territory, basic game theory basically suggests that if you make the cost of taking that territory unbearable, a rational actor just stops trying to take it.
But Beebe says that game theory totally falls apart here. Why? Why doesn't escalating the pain work in this specific scenario?
Because it completely misdiagnoses what the conflict is actually about from the Russian perspective. Russia does not view this as a localized border dispute with Ukraine.
They don't?
No, not at all. They view this as a massive existential proxy war with the West. From Moscow's vantage point, this is a broader geopolitical conflict about the fundamental parameters of European security. I mean, it's a conflict that's been brewing basically since the fall of the Berlin Wall.
So by escalating the tactical pain, the West thinks they're creating a pathway to peace, but Russia interprets that exact same action as confirmation of an existential threat.
Exactly. Escalation just validates their deepest fears. It reinforces this narrative inside the Kremlin that the West is actively trying to, weaken or destroy the Russian state using Ukraine as the vehicle.
It's like trying to cure a fever by turning up the thermostat in the room so the body sweats it out faster. I mean, you might just kill the patient.
That is a great way to put it, yeah. And the historical precedent is really clear here. When a nuclear-armed power feels its very existence is threatened, they don't back down to preserve resources.
They double down.
They double down for survival.
And Beebe actually points to a very specific example of this cycle playing out recently, right?
Yeah, he does. So Ukraine launched these long-range drone attacks, operating on that logic of making Russia feel the pain of the war at home.
Right.
But Russia didn't sue for peace. They escalated their own strategic air campaign, and crucially, they closed the port of Odessa.
Oh, man. Which is just devastating to Ukraine's economic future.
Completely devastating. The attempt to escalate did not lead to de-escalation at all. It simply shifted the conflict to a much more destructive equilibrium for everyone involved.
Okay, but I have to play devil's advocate here.
Go for it.
If you don't escalate when someone invades their neighbor, aren't you just rewarding aggression? I can hear people listening to this asking, like, how does enlarging the problem not just look like straight-up appeasement?
That's the million-dollar question.
Like, if a bully punches you
Yep.
and you refuse to punch back harder, doesn't the bully just keep taking your lunch money?
Well, answering that requires us to really zoom out from the physical battlefield in Ukraine. We have to look at the entire structural map of European security.
Okay, zoom out how?
Enlarging the problem doesn't mean giving the bully your lunch money. It means looking at the environment that is producing the violence in the first place. Beebe argues this all hinges on this diplomatic concept called the indivisibility of security.
The indivisibility of security. Okay, break down the mechanics of that concept for me. What does that actually mean?
It's a foundational international relations principle. It was codified heavily during the Cold War. You see it in the 1975 Helsinki Final Act, and again in the 1990s with the Paris Charter.
Okay.
In plain English, it just means that one nation cannot advance its own security in a way that fundamentally threatens the security of another nation.
Oh, I see. It's the classic security dilemma. It's like, imagine two neighbors who really don't trust each other, right? One neighbor buys a guard dog just to feel safe. But the other neighbor sees this big, aggressive dog, gets scared, and builds a 10-foot electric fence.
Right.
Now, the first neighbor looks at the electric fence, assumes an attack is imminent, and goes and buys a gun. Both people are taking rational steps to increase their own safety, but the mechanism itself is turning the neighborhood into a powder keg.
That is the perfect analogy. You cannot have a secure West if Russia feels fundamentally insecure, and vice versa. The security of the continent is indivisible.
You can't just draw a line down the middle of Europe and say, we're safe over here, good luck dealing with your paranoia over there.
Exactly. You just can't.
But wait, this brings up a massive contradiction. What about a sovereign country's right to choose its own alliances?
Yes.
I mean, if a nation like Ukraine wants to join NATO for its own protection against a neighbor it doesn't trust, doesn't it have the absolute right to do that? Doesn't territorial integrity and national sovereignty matter at all?
You've just identified the absolute core tension of modern diplomacy right there.
Really?
Yeah. You have two perfectly valid, internationally recognized principles, and they're colliding head-on. On one hand, you have the principle of territorial integrity and the right of a sovereign state to choose its own military alliances. On the other hand, you have the indivisibility of security.
So if you apply one of those principles, absolutely, you just automatically undermine the other one.
They are inherently in tension. And Beebe argues that the West has spent, the last few decades treating the right to choose alliances, specifically the right to expand NATO, as this absolute sacred principle.
Like it's non-negotiable.
Right. We haven't been willing to compromise on it at all. I mean, NATO has doubled in its membership since the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Wow, double.
Yeah. It incorporates significantly more territory and shares a much larger border with Russia today than it ever did during the Cold War.
And if you are sitting in Moscow applying that indivisibility of security rule, you view that massive military expansion toward your borders as a direct fundamental threat to your survival.
Absolutely. And they've been raising this specific issue for 30 years.
30 years.
Yeah. Long before the invasion of Ukraine, both the Medvedev and Putin governments literally put draft treaties on the table. They were pleading to discuss this indivisible security concept.
And what did the U.S. say?
The response was consistently that NATO's open-door policy is simply not up for negotiation.
So, okay, how do you balance these contradictory principles? If the U.S. and NATO won't dissolve, and, I mean, Beebe is very clear that the U.S. is not going to and shouldn't dissolve NATO.
Definitely not.
What is the practical mechanism to actually enlarge this into a solution? What does that look like?
Well, Beebe suggests we need a completely new security architecture for Europe because the old attempt to give Russia a voice, the NATO-Russia Council, structurally, it was just deeply flawed.
Because it didn't give them any actual leverage.
Exactly. The West's approach in that council was essentially to allow Russia a voice, but absolutely no vote.
Oh, I see.
NATO would make sovereign decisions about expansion or military posture. They'd inform Russia about those decisions, allow them to, voice their complaints, and then proceed with zero power given to Russia to change the outcome.
Which would obviously never satisfy a nation that's already terrified about encirclement.
Right. So Beebe proposes creating a relatively small pan-European equivalent to the UN Security Council.
Okay, interesting.
A mechanism separate from NATO where Russia actually has a legitimate seat and real structural power in European security decisions.
So it forces a space where these contradictory principles, like sovereignty versus shared security, can be constantly negotiated.
Exactly. Winston Churchill called it moving from war to jaw-jaw.
Jaw-jaw, like that.
Beebe argues that just the act of sitting down with Russia to acknowledge that this tension even exists, admitting that we need to balance their security with our allies' sovereignty, that would be a massive sea change in U.S. policy.
It changes the entire calculus of the bilateral conflict in Ukraine.
It really does. And honestly, if we don't figure this out in Europe, we have to enlarge the problem globally.
Which is terrifying.
Very. Beebe argues that failing to fix this European security architecture fundamentally threatens American grand strategy everywhere else.
Right, and this connects directly to this idea that the era of liberal hegemony is over.
Yes.
For anyone listening, liberal hegemony was that brief window after the Soviet Union collapsed where the United States was basically the sole superpower.
The unipolar moment.
Yeah. The U.S. used that moment to try and enforce Western democratic and economic institutions across the entire globe, just expecting everyone else to passively acquiesce.
And that world is officially gone. We operate in a multipolar reality now.
Right. The U.S. faces a peer rival in China. And numerous middle powers like India, Brazil, or South Africa, they have way more freedom to maneuver and just say no to Washington.
Exactly. In a multipolar world, dictating terms just doesn't work anymore. You need actual strategy.
And this brings us to a really chilling historical reference Beebe makes regarding Zbigniew Brzezinski, the former U.S. National Security Advisor. He wrote a famous book called The Grand Chessboard, right?
Yes, and Brzezinski was arguably one of the premier geopolitical strategists of the 20th century.
Okay.
He warned explicitly that the absolute worst strategic outcome for the United States, like the ultimate nightmare scenario, would be the formation of a grand alliance between Russia, China, and Iran.
An anti-hegemonic coalition.
Exactly.
I mean, if you combine those three nations, you are pulling together massive natural resources from Russia, unparalleled manufacturing and economic scale from China, and critical geographic control over global energy transit from Iran.
Yep, it's a powerhouse.
It's an alliance built entirely on shared grievance against the West.
And the brutal irony that Beebe highlights here is that U.S. policies over the last few decades have actively encouraged this exact Russia-China-Iran alliance to form. Yeah, by refusing to acknowledge Russia's security concerns in Europe, and by pushing so hard on the absolute principle of NATO expansion, we've inadvertently driven our biggest adversaries right into each other's arms globally.
So by trying to maximize our security in Europe without compromising, we've basically compromised our security everywhere else.
That's the argument, yeah.
Which brings us to the most fascinating wild card on that global chessboard, Iran.
Ah, yes, Iran.
The interviewer actually asked Beebe if Eisenhower's enlarge the problem strategy can work for Iran too.
And his answer to that is perhaps the most counterintuitive yet brilliant part of his entire analysis.
Okay, let's set the baseline for everyone. The current situation with Iran is a massive deadlock.
Completely frozen.
The Iranian regime feels a deep existential threat, especially recently after the U.S. and Israel attacked and decapitated key components of its regional leadership network.
Right, and from the perspective of the Ayatollahs, a foreign power actively seeking regime change or system collapse is the ultimate existential crisis.
So how do we enlarge this? Beebe goes back to the playbook we just discussed, right? The 1975 Helsinki Accords. But he focuses on this hidden mechanism inside that agreement.
Yeah, let's unpack the history of Helsinki a bit because it is crucial here. Back in 1975, the Soviet Union wanted something very specific from the West.
What was it?
de facto recognition of their post-World War II borders. They wanted the West to formally acknowledge Soviet control over places like Poland, East Germany, and the Baltics.
Okay, and the West eventually agreed to provide that border recognition, but they slipped a Trojan horse into the treaty.
They really did. They included what became known as the human dimension. These were clauses requiring the signatories to respect basic human rights and fundamental freedoms.
And the Soviets just signed it.
Yeah. The Soviet leadership at the time completely wrote off those human rights clauses. They viewed them as just meaningless Western window dressing.
They thought it was a joke.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The Soviets pocketed the border recognition, assuming they had just won the negotiation hands down.
But the citizens living behind the Iron Curtain did not write off those clauses.
Not at all. People in the Eastern Bloc took those principles incredibly seriously. Dissidents started using the Helsinki Accords to hold their own authoritarian governments accountable.
That's brilliant.
They formed Helsinki watch groups. They essentially said, hey, you sign an international document guaranteeing us these rights, so why are we being arrested for speaking out?
Wow.
It spawned this massive, legitimate political movement from within that ultimately contributed to the total dissolution of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union.
It created an internal expectation of accountability.
Exactly.
So mapping that onto Iran today, Beebe drops a proposal that would, frankly, shock most of Washington.
Oh, definitely.
He argues the U.S. should initiate a diplomatic opening, ease economic sanctions, and actually restore normal diplomatic relations with Iran.
Which, I mean, to a lot of people, that sounds like rewarding a state sponsor of terrorism.
Right.
But if you analyze the psychological mechanics of how authoritarians actually hold on to power, it is a strategic masterstroke.
Because it relies on removing the one thing the regime needs most. Beebe uses this incredible quote from an advisor to Mikhail Gorbachev at the very end of the Cold War.
Oh, I love this quote.
Right. As the Soviet Union was collapsing, this advisor told his American counterparts, we're going to do a terrible thing to you. We're going to take away your enemy.
We're going to take away your enemy. It's so profound because authoritarian regimes, especially a heavily sanctioned theocracy like Iran, they rely entirely on having a massive external scapegoat.
They needed to survive.
They need a monster at the gates to justify their strict internal control, to excuse their massive economic failures, and to crush domestic dissent. For the Iranian regime, the United States serves perfectly as the Great Satan.
So if the U.S. normalizes relations, drops the sanctions, opens embassies, they completely pull the rug out from under the regime's core survival narrative.
Exactly. If the United States is no longer the Great Satan actively trying to destroy them, the Iranian government has to justify its failures on its own merits.
You can't just point the finger.
Right. They can't blame inflation or lack of freedom on American aggression anymore. And Beebe points out that at the popular level, a significant portion of Iranian citizens actually have relatively positive views of American society and culture.
So opening diplomatic and economic channels means the expectations of the everyday Iranian citizen will just immediately rise.
Skyrocket. They will demand better living conditions, integration with the global economy, better governance. The regime will be forced into evolutionary change from the inside out simply because they no longer have the ultimate boogeyman to point a finger at.
It is the Helsinki dynamic reborn.
It really is. You achieve your grand strategic goals not by dropping bombs or applying maximum pressure, but by deliberately removing the friction that sustains your adversary's hardline stance in the first place.
But let me challenge this for a second, just from the perspective of our actual allies on the ground. If the U.S. suddenly walks away from its posture of containing Iran, wouldn't that absolutely terrify our military partners in the Gulf region?
Oh, yeah.
Like the Saudis, the UAE, Bahrain. We have this massive military architecture built entirely on protecting them from Iran.
That is the logical counterargument, definitely. But Beebe's assessment of that military architecture is incredibly blunt. He argues that our alliance system in the Middle East is fundamentally built on sand, not concrete.
Built on sand. How does normalizing relations with Iran fix our alliance with Saudi Arabia?
Well, you have to look at the mechanical reality of modern warfare. We have these massive stationary U.S. military bases scattered across the Gulf.
Right.
In previous decades, those bases projected power, they deterred attacks. But in a modern era defined by cheap, precision drone warfare and ballistic missiles, those stationary bases are no longer assets.
Where are they?
They are sitting ducks.
Wow. There are massive liabilities.
Exactly. If a regional conflict breaks out, U.S. adversaries will immediately target those bases. And because those bases are located inside countries like the UAE or Saudi Arabia, those host nations are instantly dragged into a crossfire they wanted no part of.
That makes total sense.
The presence of U.S. troops used to bring security. Now it actively brings insecurity to our partners because it basically paints a bullseye on their territory.
So clinging to an outdated military posture based purely on what we wish the world looked like, rather than the multipolar reality of what it actually is, that's just a recipe for strategic disaster.
Precisely.
When you pull all these threads together, it paints a pretty stark picture. We're looking at Eisenhower's advice not just as a neat historical quote, but as a literal survival manual for a multipolar world.
Yeah, and applying it to Ukraine means resisting the urge to escalate tactical violence, which, as we discussed, just confirms Russia's paranoia. And instead, enlarging the scope to fix European security as a whole. It requires the incredibly difficult diplomatic work of balancing a nation's sovereign right to choose its allies against the unforgiving reality of the security dilemma.
Because failing to balance those principles is exactly what is driving our adversaries into Zbigniew Brzezinski's nightmare scenario, right? A unified alliance of Russia, China, and Iran.
Yes. And we saw how enlarging the problem with Iran, like by stepping back, normalizing relations, and easing sanctions, might actually be the most devastating diplomatic weapon available.
It's amazing.
Sometimes the absolute best way to defeat a hostile, dysfunctional regime isn't to fight them head-on, it is to just take away their enemy.
As a final reminder for you, the listener, George Beebe's framework is just one strategic perspective among many in the vast field of international relations. But it is a fascinating lens through which to view today's global headlines.
It really is. It challenges you to look past the immediate symptoms of a conflict and examine the structural disease causing it. It forces a level of critical thinking that is, frankly, often missing in a world that prefers easy sound bites and zero-sum solutions.
So, as we wrap up today, I want to leave you with a thought to mull over in your own life. Beebe points out that authoritarians rely on a great Satan to maintain their power and hide their own systemic failures.
All right.
Think about your own world, whether it's in the complex politics of your office dynamics or even personal relationships within your family. Who is the enemy in your world that might actually be the only thing holding a dysfunctional system together?
Yeah.
What happens if you just take that enemy away? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.